In these strange times that we unfortunately live in, it's good that we can cast our mind to the world's special natural places, because they are a great inspiration to all of us, whether we're visiting them or whether we're in the armchair thinking about previous visits or planning new ones. And I want to talk this evening about inspiration and challenge. You'll see on the first slide a variety of places I've had the good fortune to visit over many years of working with international colleagues. I want to focus particularly on three aspects. Why are these places very special? What are the big issues that they're facing? And are we winning the battles? Why are they special? Well, of course, they are places for great scientific endeavour. I'm giving you an example here of the Yoho National Park in the Canadian Rockies. There, scientists over many decades have discovered what we now call the Cambrian explosion, this great explosion of life 500 and odd million years ago. And that activity is still going on with new researchers, with new ideas and new minds to address them. Or we can look up into the Arctic, for instance. I was fortunate in 1972 to be part of an Aberdeen University expedition to West Spitsbergen, led by Chalmers Clapperton, that wonderful glacial geomorphologist who sadly died last year, when he was beginning his research on how glaciers move very fast, what we call surging glaciers, and in this case hit into the fiord deposits, the clays, and give these beautiful forms you see in the photograph. In other places, nature is still in charge, fortunately. We tend to think that nature has been overwhelmed by man, and that is true in many places. But for instance, if you go into the Hoh Valley of the Olympic National Park in Washington State, the USA, you will see there the forestry floor underneath Sitka spruce decaying and new birth of new Sitkas. Beautifully, the seeds sitting on the trunks and setting down their roots and growing up, totally unlike the dead forest floors of our Sitka forests in Scotland. Or in the volcanic areas, quintessentially in Iceland, where most of the central volcanoes are overlain by ice caps. The most recent large eruption was in 2015. I had the good fortune to fly over it. My goodness me, the heat from the eruption, from the fissure, was tremendous through the fuselage of the aircraft. But this eruption was underneath the ice cap, Badrabanga, and a huge spread of lava, greater than anything since the 1780s. And it caused the major river, the Yakulsa Flutlam, to be diverted. In other places, we'll see this wonderful interdependency. And I use that term because everybody tends to think of biodiversity, but actually we should be thinking of geodiversity as well. As a geographer, geomorphologist, you'd expect me to be keen on that. And a group of us internationally have been working on that, and a little more later on. That is that interdependency between what we call the abiotic and the biotic parts of nature, which you see here in these hot springs and the Tarangiro National Park in North Island, New Zealand, or you can see, for instance, on the slopes of the Kosciuszko National Park in New South Wales in Australia, where you have, as a result of climate, soil type, rock type and weather, different vegetation zones as you go up to the top of the mountain. For many national parks and the great protected areas of the world have strong cultural connections. A very good example is in Slovenia. Here we have Triglav, the mountain that every Slovene really should climb in their lifetime. And people like me who visited the country need to go there as well, as you can see. This is a wonderfully redolent picture here of the National Poets anniversary at the end of January each year in the little town of Verba, with the national flag, with the peaks of Triglav on the flag itself. That's the white, blue and red flag, and the peaks of the mountain in the background. But perhaps the most amazing experience I've ever had was in the Olduvai Gorge in the Ngorongoro conservation area of Tanzania. This is where the Leakeys, father and son, discovered early hominoids walking on two legs. And it all resulted from this juxtaposition of a big rift valley, tectonic plate boundaries, particular climatic conditions, particular weather conditions, which modern scientists have said made it a unique place in the world. And of course, there are so many places in the world, including in Scotland, where you just say, oh, it is magnificent, awe and wonder. Here's just one very small example in the Galapagos archipelago, for example, and here's another in a public park in the Kunming of the Yunnan province. So why do these places exist? Well, because they are important for the evolution of thinking and knowledge about our natural world. They are a place for education. There are, of course, tremendous cultural linkages. They're a place that we can enjoy, whether we're there or where we're looking at our pictures or other people's, and hopefully you're looking at mine this evening. And they are, I think, also so important ethically in our modern world that we should not forget that, just because, as I say there, they're nature's best. And we're very fortunate to have people with tremendous foresight over decades. On the left there is, of course, John Muir, a man with tremendous vision and an ability to communicate that vision to all, set off the World National Parks movement. And the guy on the top right, yes, he was a scientist, Arthur Tansley, the founder of ecology, but also one of the forefathers of nature conservation in the UK. On the bottom right there, Peter Scott, who of course set up the Slimbridge Reserve on the Severn in Gloucestershire, but also was one of the founding fathers of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And then the two guys in the middle at the top, Kenton Miller from the World Resources Institute in Washington, who made us think about the context of these special places in the surrounding countryside. And this wonderful little New Zealander, Bing Lewis, who ran the Department of Conservation of Nature there. And both of those guys were leaders in the international movement for protecting nature in the early parts of my career. And the work of these and many other people led to this wonderful flowering of lots of institutions. You see the names there. And there's one in the middle called the IUCN, which is the body of NGOs and many others. There are lots of special places around the world under international systems of UNESCO. World Heritage Sites like St Kilda, Man and the Biosphere Reserves like Galloway and Southern Ayrshire, and global geoparks like Shetland and Assynt, for example. And in Europe we have this amazing network which we are told will be able to be continued, the Natura 2000 network, which has been so important in improving our nature conservation. But there are lots of big issues. You've only got to look at the headlines in papers. On the one hand, lots of areas declared protected, but other times people saying, well, trophy hunting is good and there are rangers being killed. Let's have a quick look at some of these issues. One of them is what I call ignoring the consequences. The Jordanian government decided it wanted to bring back the Arabian oryx, and it designated some oases to the east of Amman, the capital city. But the trouble was that the amount of water that the city was taking, as is shown in this graph, see the red line there, see the decline in the amount of water available for those desert oases, and that undermined the programme. Or in the Tatra National Park in Slovakia, for instance, where fern winds come off the Tatra Mountains on a fairly regular course. But the development people wanted to get rid of all the trees. We had an international mission, we produced a report, and you'll see us there in the Ministry of Environment in Bratislava and giving interviews to television. Sadly, that situation hasn't improved. Another way of looking at this is thinking differently, and I think this is really a message of the time, where we link nature and the economy. I'm giving an example here on the Danube Delta. It was traditional to burn the reed beds so that you got some new growth. Nobody knew really what to do with them, and we set up a project, a group of us based in the UK but with Ukrainian connections, to harvest the reed and to process it to make pellets. And you can see in the inset at the top of the picture pellets, and that's going quite well. It's quite slow to do that sort of thing, but it makes a different approach. Just like the Thais have done at the Doi Ithanan National Park, north of Chiang Mai in northern Thailand, where it's a wonderful area. It's celebrated also for its cultural history, but there's a lot of poverty, a lot of problems with people, and therefore they decided to set up a whole horticultural network within the edge of the park. And I think that's a very vital thing, a connection between local communities in the park and on the edge of the park and people with disabilities of one sort or another, and giving them a new look at the world. I think you'll all recognise this third one, too much development and too many people. There are so many examples. We even got it here, you know. There's the debate about should we really have a funicular railway or rebuild it up the Cairngorms. This example here is the Grossglockner, the wonderful high mountain of Austria, but with this major car park, which you see in the photograph on the right, behind the photographer in the photo on the left. The Galapagos Marine National Park is a major example of that. The Ecuadorian government has really allowed 3 times more people to settle on the archipelago islands than really is the carrying capacity. And we have not real control systems. People are allowed to go too close to nature, despite wanting to get a very good sighting of the wonderful blue-footed booby at the southern gannet, for instance, or to sit in a lava tunnel as if we're in a Formula One car. And vast numbers of people. We saw that particularly in China, in the Jiazhugu National Park, a World Heritage Site, but just crowds and crowds of people, and maybe people going for entirely the wrong reason, getting dressed up and taking the proverbial selfie. Something you will have probably come across is the issue of rangers, guides, wardens, whatever you want to call them. Sadly, they're seen as fair game for poachers and armed militia. 1,000 deaths in 10 years, and people just doing their job. And the International Ranger Association has this roll of honour, and here's a map showing the deaths of various sorts. It's a major issue. The Virunga National Park in the so-called Democratic Republic of Congo as the worst place of all. It's rich in elephants, rhinos, etc. And a number of people have been campaigning, like the Duke of Cambridge, of course, a St Andrews geographer, excellent. Wildlife crime has become a serious threat to the sovereignty and stability of some of our countries, etc. So, ladies and gentlemen, are we winning the battle? I don't think really, but I don't want to end up on a pessimistic note in this presentation. We're all aware of the bad practices from the work we've been doing internationally. These areas are over-marketed. People now collect national parks as places to visit. They collect World Heritage Sites as, oh, how many have you been to? It's bragging rights, isn't it, for us, dare I say it, middle-class professionals. A lot of these places are overused, too many people there, but also what happens on the just outside the boundary, the deforestation to supply timber to the mills, which has a devastating impact, for instance, in the Olympic National Park in Washington State, on the mammalian population within that park. For instance, the deforestation for palm oil next to national parks in parts of Indonesia. We have the tick-box tourists, as I call them, We have huge culture clashes with local populations. For example, why should visitors come and dictate what happens when Indigenous communities, local communities have been living in these areas and understanding how to care for and look after nature, because it's their birthright, it's their asset which they want to hand on to future generations. And of course, the profit mentality comes in all too often in these things. And, you know, in a sense, the big game hunting which still carries on and the bushmeat wars in these parks is still a problem, and it's driven by those external forces. Okay, what needs to be done therefore? If one looks at these fabulous places like the 12 Apostles Marine National Park, by the way, there aren't 12 apostles anymore because some of these sea stacks have fallen down, but there are new ones forming in the cliffs. But that aside, the first thing in my view is to try and gain political support for delivering international targets. Now that's a very high blown. What we're talking about here is that we have, through the UN system, a lot of protected areas under UNESCO, as I indicated earlier. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, and you'll have read our Geographer magazine on that. We have the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Combating Desertification. Now, all of these are separate efforts and they're not always cross-linked. What we have had in the last year or so, and we represent this in the issue of the Geographer which came out earlier this year, is a major challenge to say it's not business as usual, it's not sameness, it's business unusual, or as some people say, it's transformational change. How can we change the mindsets of ourselves and our friends in the context of global climate change crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and now the first of the major pandemics? And I say the first because inevitably others will follow, because we've interfered with nature and put a new interaction between nature and humans which enables disease transmission to go much further. So in the next year or so, with the Conference of Parties for the Framework Convention on Climate Change happening in Glasgow, and the Conference of Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity happening in Kunming in Yunnan province of China at the end of next year as well, gives us an opportunity. But we need to think about that and lobby our politicians to make sure that that happens. It's all pretty clear to me that we don't want to stop people visiting those areas, and I've deliberately put in a little inset on that picture, the don't do this, that or the other. That is so off-putting and it really annoys me, and I want to tear the sign down. But there are places which are very precious, and getting a permit to enter, like here in the Beveja National Park in northeast Poland, for instance, or charging people to visit. And having real protection in some places, maybe by season because of the breeding populations. All of these things should help to enhance the visitor experience, to use a popular phrase, rather than to say, well, you can't come here at all. There are lots of ways of managing these things. And we also need to think in some of these special places where there are natural hazards, like volcanic eruptions, like the mud flows, the lahars, for instance, that flow down mountainsides, particularly in the Andes. And we've seen those in Ecuador, for instance, as a result of Cotopaxi eruptions, to make sure that people are safe and properly looked after as well, and that they have a good educational experience. It's not a matter of putting signs all round the countryside or having high-tech visitor centres. It's actually a matter of saying, well, how do we communicate the wonder and the beauty of nature, the fragility, and all of the services it provides for us, the clean water, the fresh air, the rekindling of the mind and the spirit. It's fantastic, those places. throughout the decades of protecting nature, it's been very much have to admit, a white Caucasian male approach to the world. And we have forgotten until relatively recently the importance of engaging with what we call internationally the local and indigenous communities. I just give a small example here in the Pasina National Park on the Danube in Bulgaria, where we got all the locals to say, well, what do you think about this? What is your vision? What can you contribute? What do you bring as your inheritance to those areas? And it was so fantastic to just hear these people talking about it with increasing enthusiasm, but more to the point, to recognise that they were part of the future as opposed to some group parked on the sidelines for us specialists to dictate to. But talking about specialists, well, I'm a great believer in using expert advisors. And by experts, I mean people who can learn from each other and can learn by walking around the world. I've learned so much, and I used to bring lots of lessons back in my days in Scottish Natural Heritage. They used to say, oh my goodness, Roger, where's he been now and what ideas has he got? But that's really important. So I've been fortunate to be a member of what's grandly called the World Commission on Protected Areas, part of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, now for 25 years. And here is a gang of us. I obviously took the photographs, so I'm not in the picture, but from all around the world from diverse experiences. And they have been able to develop a whole new approaches. What is called the green list. What are the really best of the best? Which are the exemplars of best practice that we can say, that's how you should be doing it. Also to say, we don't just want politicians to say, well, we've set up a whole new national park system, or we've covered 100,000 hectares in parks, if these really only exist on paper. So what we call protected area management effectiveness. In other words, making sure that they're properly looked after is important. And to help with that, we've been producing best practice guidelines. Oh dear, that sounds weary. It was quite weary. We're about to publish later this year the guidelines for geoconservation in protected and conserved areas. And it's interesting that two fellows of this society, our society, myself and John Gordon, along with an Edinburgh geography geomorphology graduate, Murray Gray, have been working with an international group to produce these guidelines. Oh, where do we go then? Well, I show this picture. It's not in focus. I was at the back of the room of 3,000 people. And I get emotional. You'll recognise that guy. And that's what Nelson Mandela said to the gathering of experts in Durban in 2003. And I'm going to read it. A sustainable future for humankind depends on a caring partnership with nature. We pledge to bequeath protected areas as precious heritage to future generations. And there was Queen Noor of Jordan sitting next to him. But maybe there's another way to look at this, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe my grandchildren and your grandchildren will say, I don't want to protect the environment. I want to create a world where the environment doesn't need protecting.